Morning, Congressman.
Success.
Success.
I feel like
Success.
after all of these years of virtual meetings, I should stop celebrating when I successfully get onto a Zoom, but it still feels like an accomplishment.
I'm with you. I only recently conquered conference calls. So, step at a time. Step at a time. We're live, and I promised people we'd start at 9. So
Right?
without objection, sir, I will dive into some logistics, some intros, and get to the conversation.
You got it.
Terrific. So thanks everybody for joining. And I know folks are still logging in. My name is Peter Loge. I'm the director of the Project on Ethics and Political Communication at the George Washington University. Here we promote, study, and teach the political communication ethics. We ask advocates what ethical responsibilities, if any, they have, and to whom or what they have them. And we do this in a number of ways. One is to teach a class, edited a book. We write for political and popular press, quoted in the media, give talks at universities, organizations, companies. We work on case studies with the University of Texas at Austin, do a bunch of stuff online, send out weekly updates. And from time to time, we are honored to be joined by actual people who actually do politics and can talk about ethical responsibilities and options. And I'm really thrilled to have one of those people with me this morning, Congressman Kilmer, of Democrat of Washington State. His resume is long and our time is short, so I'll hit a couple of highlights. And I will say, I should have said at the top, this is obviously being recorded, and I'll send a link around to everybody who registered, and I'll post it online and move it around. So your ethical insights will live in perpetuity, Congressman. Congressman Kilmer earned his BA from Princeton, PhD from Oxford, after which he joined McKinsey, and then he went home to Washington State to serve. He's elected to the State House, later to the State Senate, and in 2012 elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, where he has served since. Currently sits on House Appropriations. Most importantly for our purposes, he co-chaired the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress, which has been dissolved. So I guess Congress is modern enough, I think, is the lesson we can take from that. And I have to say, on a personal note, I spent a lot of time working in politics and been around a lot of elected officials, and Mr. Kilmer is one of the kindest, most thoughtful and generous members of the House of Representatives I've had the pleasure of talking to. And it is a real thrill to be with you this morning. Congressman, welcome to the conversation.
Great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
So let's get right to it. Congressman, as you saw, I've asked a bunch of people to weigh in about why they think people in politics should be ethical. We have input on our website from a philosopher here at GW, from a journalist, a handful of Democratic and Republican operatives. From your perspective, why should elected officials and candidates behave ethically?
Well, there's, I think, a lot of elements that undergird the question you just asked. One of the first things, anytime I bring on a new member of my team and I give them their instructions for the role, one of the first things I say is, we run an ethical office, which means in the things that you think, say, and do, the things you put into writing, the things you say publicly or privately, you should presume that they could end up in the front page of the paper because they just might. And I would never want to embarrass my constituents or myself in that way, and I hope that you wouldn't want to either. Now, being ethical is beyond just trying to avoid shame. It's also, sets the tone of what kind of government that we want. To me, having a government that's grounded in ethical approaches, making sure that we're, maybe to lean on the Rotarian four-way test, is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? And will it be beneficial to all concerned? At least seems like an approach, A, that's too often missing in our politics, but B, I think is fundamental if we're going to have something other than the Hunger Games.
So this is really I like the two-part test. Let's start with the first one. When you said avoid being in the front page of the paper, heard that from the couple of folks from whom I solicited input, both Democrats and Republicans. And when a number of people registered for this event, I asked, why should you be ethical? And a number of them said to avoid turning up on the front page of the paper. Yeah. So there's obviously the incentive piece, which I want to come back to.
Sure.
But before that, I want to get to the other piece, which I think is super important and is often lost. And that is, we should be ethical, not just to avoid punishment, but it sets tone for the kind of government we want. How do campaigns, how does political rhetoric actually impact how we govern and sort of who we are as a polity?
Poorly, is the short answer. I mean, we have currently, and again, you mentioned incentives. A lot of the attention, a lot of the virality on social media, a lot of the campaign funding goes to they who are the most extreme voices. And that applies not just in campaign season, but even to governing. I chaired the New Democrat Coalition, and I often joked that as the chair of the New Dems, I'd like to hold a rally on the steps of the Capitol where I would yell, "What do we want?" And everyone would yell, "A comprehensive approach to job creation that includes infrastructure investment, workforce development, and a smarter approach to taxes and trade." And then I'd yell, "When do we want it?" And everyone would yell, "We're willing to work in a collaborative way that brings people together." No one shows up at that rally, right?
That's a
Like,
very big T-shirt, I have to say. That'd be
I
a
have to
heck of
tell
a.
you, my bumper stickers go all the way around the car. And so, the incentives aren't great. And, you add in how we choose candidates in primaries, which are often closed primaries and low turnout, that makes it more challenging. I've been told by someone who does online political fundraising that I just simply wasn't outrageous enough to raise money through emails, that I had to say things that were more partisan. And that's just, I mean, at the end of the day, and this gets at your question of why function in an ethical way. Like, I don't like this job enough to optimize around keeping it. I want to be able to look myself in the mirror, my kids in the eye, and my constituents in the eye and say, I'm doing what I think is right. And you may disagree with it, but I'm doing what I think is right.
So how do we then, I want to come to the incentive piece.
Sure.
Because as you say, it's governing can sound awful, can be, the rhetoric isn't good. The most recent State of Congress 2024 report from the Congressional Management Foundation,
Yeah.
which I'm waving around and will email around, found that senior staff think it's important for members and staffers to be civil and to work across party lines. Senior staffers believe polarization and the rhetoric are making it difficult to get things done in Congress and are causing them to consider leaving Congress, right? I mean, your view that it isn't as good as it should be isn't just shared by the American people, it's shared by the people actually in the institution.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things you did on the Congressional Modernization Committee was the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress is recommendations to foster collaboration and civility in Congress. So what are some of those incentives that we can build into the system to make it more likely people will be better or at least less awful?
Let me just share some of the things we did on the Modernization Committee, because I think it's instructive, A, of how it could work, and B, I think it'll give you a sense um, of, sort of how we avoided some of the toxicity that you see in nearly every other committee in the Congress. So the first thing that happens when you get a new committee is the committee gets funded, and then simple math occurs, and Democrats get their half of the money and Republicans get their half of the money. Generally, Democrats take their half and they hire people with a Democratic background who put on blue jerseys, and Republicans use their half of the money to hire people with a Republican background who put on red jerseys. And then they spend the rest of the time fighting with each other. When our committee was formed, we received our allocation of resources, and I called my Republican counterpart, Tom Graves, who is a Republican from Georgia, from a very deep red district, who came in as a self-described bomb-throwing Tea Partier. His district is so conservative, when he left Congress, that seat is now filled by Marjorie Taylor Greene. And I called up Tom and I said, got a crazy idea for you. What if we don't split the resources and instead force multiply? What if we just have one team? Some will be Democrats, some will be Republicans. We will hire them together, and rather than putting on red and blue jerseys, we'll get them to put on jerseys that say, hey, let's fix Congress. And to his credit, he said, my leadership's going to hate that idea, but let's do it. The first thing we did as a committee was we had a bipartisan planning retreat, where Democrats and Republicans on the committee went to the Library of Congress and spent a day basically initially getting to know each other with a simple couple questions of, why did you run for Congress and how has it met or failed to meet your expectations? And then two, we plan together. What do you want to get? What do you want to do on this committee? And I had perspectives as a committee chair of what I wanted to get done, but I think, it's hard to get people there for the landing if you haven't invited them for the takeoff. And so part of the rationale, and I've never been part of a functional organization that didn't at the beginning say, hey, what do we want to do? What does success look like? So we went through that exercise. And I think, one of the challenges you see in Congress is when people are sidelined, it's a little bit like my puppy, right? Like, when you don't keep Penny, the Australian Shepherd, busy, she chews the furniture, right? And there's a lot of furniture chewing that happens in Congress because people feel like they're sidelined. If you watch one of our hearings on C-SPAN, you have too much time on your hands. But if you do watch one of our hearings on C-SPAN, you'll notice that we didn't sit Democrats on one side of a dais and Republicans on the other. We sat Democrat, Republican, Democrat, Republican. Why? Well, when I hear a witness say something interesting, my genetic predisposition is to lean over to the person next to me and say, hey, that was kind of interesting. What do you think about that? And in our committee, we're leaning over to someone from a different party. We didn't even sit at a dais. We sat around a big round table. Why? Well, it's hard to have good conversation speaking to the back of someone's head, which is how most committees function, in quotes, in Congress. And so what we did was we had the capacity to look each other in the eye, have discussion rather than debate. We didn't put people on the clock and say you're limited to 5 minutes. We basically said, if you've got a question, if you want to pull on a thread of something a witness just said, just raise your hand and we'll call on you. And you know what? Nobody abused it. Not one. And I share that with you because, there's a tendency to say, well, but that could never work in another committee. Well, yeah, actually it could, because we had very conservative Republicans. We had the chair of the Progressive Caucus, and yet we managed to have collaborative discussion that, and that was not cosmetic. We passed more than 200 recommendations focused on making Congress work better for the American people. That's about incentives. That's about norms, right? I came out of a state legislature where every bill was taken up under an open rule, meaning that if you had an amendment that was germane to the bill, you could offer it, it would be debated, and it would be voted on. In 8 years in the Washington State Legislature, I can only remember 5 or 6 times where someone used that to try to score political points, where they were using it for politics rather than to actually try to make policy. Only 5 or 6 times, but that wasn't because there was a rule in the Washington State Legislature saying, hey, don't be a jerk. It was because the norm was don't be a jerk. And so, I think there is value in trying to figure out how to set the tone better, how to include all voices, even if they're voices that you don't agree with, but to make sure that they're heard, treat people with respect, and have approaches that might yield different outcomes. Sorry, that was
So
a
I
long
want to,
answer, but obviously we thought a lot about this stuff.
no, it's a good and I appreciate the depth of the answer. You said there's value in how you set the tone, and I know that the committee had a couple of recommendations to do that, but as you said, there's got to be some norm setting.
Sure.
So how do you in the modernization committee? Like I get that you had very conservatives and very liberals on the
Yeah.
committee, but they were there because they believed in modernization of Congress. How do you set the tone in Congress writ large or in other often more contentious committees?
Well, we actually recommended that every committee have a bipartisan planning retreat for the very reason I just said, which is, you can't be functional if you don't define what success is, which is not to say Democrats and Republicans on the Judiciary Committee are going to sit in a room and agree on the path forward. But maybe there are some areas of agreement where people can say, like, okay, well, maybe we can work on some stuff, right? I think where the American people get frustrated is when Congress can't even move forward on the things upon which there is agreement. We also recommended that there be a bipartisan retreat for Congress writ large. There used to be one, actually. And it was an opportunity for members and their families to get together, develop relationships, and at least do some level setting on what that Congress was going to get done. We had a hearing, I'll give you one other example. We had a hearing on civility. If I joked about, whether if you watch one of our hearings, you've got too much time on your hands. I actually do recommend, if anybody has, 2.5 hours, it is worth watching the hearing we did on civility. We invited in a management consultant, an organizational psychologist, a political scientist and the founder of Braver Angels, whose background was as a marriage counselor. I thought about bringing in an exorcist, but it was a really interesting and dynamic discussion around culture. And afterwards, the organizational psychologist called me up and said, "Hey, I got someone I think you should talk to. I got an NCAA football coach who took over a losing team with a terrible culture, and he turned them into winners." So I call up this coach, and the first thing he says to me is, "Derek, I don't know anything about Congress." I said, "I don't want to ask you about Congress. I want to ask you about culture." And he said, I said, "What do you do when you got players on the team that are actively trying to sabotage the team?" And he said, "Well, I cut them." I said, "Well, we don't really have that option." And he said, "Well, how do you do new player orientation?" And I said, "That's a really interesting question." I said, "We don't have new player orientation, but we do have new member orientation." He said, "How does it work?" I said, "It's funny, it works entirely the wrong way. You have members who show up, literally, this is not a joke, where they say, there's a sign that says, 'Democrats, you get on this bus, and Republicans, you get on that bus.'" My orientation process was entirely an exercise in trying to get the two parties from talking to each other, to keep them apart. And you know, the entire exercise bakes in partisanship from the beginning. And this football coach said to me, "Well, I don't know much about Congress, but it seems like you ought to stop doing that." So one of our 202 recommendations was stop doing that. Have the tone set at the beginning toward bipartisanship and collaboration. In fact, we recommended that there be a session on collaboration at orientation.
And one of the recommendations I think that I found really interesting along those lines is you recommended setting up bipartisan co-working spaces for staff,
Yeah.
right?
This is a big deal. The reality is there's, and there's good social science on this, right? Space matters, spatial relations matter. And having a place where Democrats and Republicans can sit and collaborate, where nobody has a home field advantage, matters. And so we recommended and have implemented the creation of a bipartisan collaboration space. And you know what? It gets used. It gets used a lot. We also recommended doing that for members. The pandemic was terrible. One of the only benefits that we saw was that the speaker's lobby, they punted the press from the speaker's lobby. And the speaker's lobby became a place where Democrats and Republicans kind of hung out outside of the C-SPAN cameras and developed relationships. Now, once the pandemic was over, the press re-entered the speaker's lobby, and now there's really not a place where Democrats and Republicans do that. But those sorts of things, again, are not cosmetic. When you develop relationships with somebody, it makes it a lot harder to, treat them like garbage. I'll mention one other thing only because I think it's kind of interesting. One of the challenges that we face also is it's hard to develop relationships when we're just not here that much. The average week, we fly in on a Monday for 6:30 p.m. votes. We have full days Tuesday and Wednesday, and we're done Thursday by noon. For those of us on the West Coast, I don't have a flight until like 5:45. And then rinse, wash, repeat 30 weeks out of the year. What does that mean? Well, I don't know the data for this year. I should have looked it up. But for 2019, pre-pandemic, what that meant was we had 65 full days in office in DC and 66 travel days. 65 full days, 66 travel days. Meaning we are spending more time with the terrific people of Alaska Airlines than we are in committee doing the work of legislating. It also means the average member of Congress is on over 5 committees and subcommittees, all of which are scheduled only on the full days, which means if you're watching C-SPAN and it looks like a third of the committee isn't there or 2/3 of the committee is there, it's usually not because they're playing hooky. It's because they're in 2 or 3 other committees or subcommittees at the same time. What does that mean? Well, it means that Congress becomes a place where committees become a place where rather than listening to each other and having discussion and developing knowledge and developing policy, committees are a place where you airdrop in right before it's your turn to speak. You give a 5-minute speech that you can rip and put on social media, and then you run to your next committee. That does not, in terms of culture, that does not lend itself to collaboration or to policy making. People complain that too often policy is made out of the speaker's office or out of the leadership offices, and that committees have been sidelined. One of the ways to get committees back on the field is to change the schedule and calendar, which is another area that we've made recommendations.
I mean, that's a familiar refrain. I mean, certainly when I was the chief of staff in the mid-90s, people were around more, but it was post Gingrich and there was more time in the district. And one of the arguments for more time in the district is you're representing your constituents, so you ought to spend time with them. If you spend time in Washington, you end up representing, the speaker or the guy who sits next to you in the hearing.
Yeah.
Now, something that we've heard a lot, I want to come back to, is again, this question of other incentives, right? Keep off the front page of the Washington Post, keep off the front page of the Chicago Tribune or whatever newspaper,
Sure.
the feedback I got was from. Others, I'm looking now at responses from registrants, it's a re-election. Risk of looking bad for your voters. If you should be ethical, you should behave well, because your voters will punish you. But as you said, somebody will drop into a hearing, say something, leave the hearing, throw it on social media, get a lot of, likes or re-X's or whatever, raise money off of it and say, look, I'm standing up for your thing, those crazy people, and they get reelected, right? And voters in many cases, punish elected officials who try to be bipartisan, who have that the bumper sticker that wraps all the way around the car.
Yeah.
What do you do about the external political incentives to behave in ways that are not great?
Well, there's a couple of things I would do. One is I think you have to find ways to change the incentives. So, you mentioned that voters have a tendency to punish collaboration. Well, that's true in systems where there are closed primaries that have low turnout. And I contrast that with states that have experimented with, top two primaries like Washington and California, or ranked choice voting in Maine and Alaska. That, those systems don't just change how campaigns occur, and they don't just change who you elect, they change how you govern. I don't think it's an accident that those states that had a top two primary had a disproportionate number of the Republicans who voted to impeach Donald Trump. It's because they felt empowered to do what they thought was right without the threat of primary loss. Some of them were right, some of them were wrong, and some of them retired. But it really does change how you govern. So I think that's a reform that if we want to be serious about changing incentives, there's more political science that needs to happen on different forms of primary. But I have zero question that it does affect how you govern. The number of my colleagues who have said to me, man, I would work with you on this, but I would get killed in a primary if I worked with you, is a real problem. The other piece of this is just a recognition, as you just put it, that to some degree, members of Congress are reflective of their district. And the division that we see in Congress is reflective of the division that we see in our communities. I got invited to a YMCA a couple of years ago thinking they were going to talk to me about gymnasiums losing money during the pandemic. What they wanted to talk to me about was fights breaking out at the Y over politics, over the hat someone was wearing, or the shirt someone was wearing, or the cable news channel someone was watching on the elliptical. And they said it's become so bad, they've hired a consultant to train their staff and train their board in conflict resolution, that they're hosting bridging events to try to get people to talk across their differences rather than having the YMCA turn into the Jerry Springer show. And they said, just out of curiosity, is there any federal support for anything like that? And I looked into it. As it turns out, the United States actually does spend tens of millions of dollars each year trying to foster social cohesion and build bridges across lines of difference as a means of strengthening democracy in other countries through the National Endowment for Democracy. But we don't do that here in America. And so I've sponsored a bill called the Building Civic Bridges Act. And interestingly, it is bipartisan. When we introduced it in the last Congress, it was with 11 Democrats and 11 Republicans. And it would just set up a pilot program through AmeriCorps to support these hyper-local efforts to try to bridge some of the divides that we're seeing in our communities. It would also train AmeriCorps members in the skills related to bridge building, and it would support colleges and universities that are doing research in this space. I think, again, if we want to get serious about the divides that we see in our country, we need to make investments like that. There were two polls last year that I found frightening, to the point that they kept me up at night. One was an NBC News poll that found that 70% of Americans agree with the statement, America is so divided that it is no longer capable of solving big problems, and it's getting worse. The other one was a battleground poll that asked Americans on a scale of 0 to 100, with 0 being no conflict and 100 being civil war, where do you put the United States? And the median score was a 70, meaning Americans thought we were more than 2/3 of the way to civil war. Now, I don't know about you, and I don't know about those who are watching this, but what I can tell you is I'm just not willing to sit here and say, well, I guess that's life in 2024, and we're not going to get anything done, and maybe we'll have, potential civil war or whatever, right? Like, I think each of us should say, hey, I'm not okay with that. And what can I do to try to bridge some of these divides?
There are a lot of alarming surveys coming out. I'm glad you highlighted that. And I'll also email around as part of my follow-up your legislation. And I love that it's tied to AmeriCorps, which is coming up on its 30th anniversary. It seems
Yeah.
well timed. I try to reach a wide audience. Hopefully this will reach a lot of political professionals and consultants and others, but my primary constituency are college undergraduates, many of whom are studying political communication and journalism. In the remaining couple of minutes, what advice do you have for up and coming political operatives and journalists?
Well, I guess let me say a couple things. One, I might have different advice to political operatives than I do to journalists, right? I have great respect in the sort of journalism arena for folks like Amanda Ripley, who've said, I'm not just going to cover conflict. I'm going to cover those who are trying to overcome conflict, right? And some of the questions that you asked me, in her book, High Conflict, she has this concept that I think is really on target that she calls conflict entrepreneurs, people who profit off of stirring, conflict. And it's really hard. I'm in Congress because you're, surrounded by conflict entrepreneurs. And, she lays out some interesting strategies for dealing with it. But I think the most important thing is she covers things that aren't just about conflict. She covers stories about overcoming conflict. And I know journalism is increasingly, a business. But I think, selling a story of America, I'm going to see Ken Burns tonight at the Library of Congress, and he's noted for saying, our national motto is E pluribus unum. And these days it feels like we have a lot of pluribus and not a lot of unum. But I think sometimes there's value in covering the unum, right? Those things that unite us, not just those things that divide us. The other piece of it is, for political communications, I'm 20 years into public service. I did 12 in Congress and 8 in the state legislature. I've never run a negative ad. I have had political consultants who very much wanted me to run negative ads, but I think it is important to, be able to look yourself in the mirror and say, am I making things worse or making things better? And, that to some degree is an ethical question, and it's not to say that you can't criticize people that have an approach, it's okay to be uh, outraged when people do things that are outrageous. It's okay to call them out for that. But there are, I think there's a line, right? There's a line in terms of what represents legitimate political criticism and what's just, vile, toxic garbage that makes our politics worse. And, for those who are entering that arena, I do think it's important to gut check, what you're doing.
Great words to end with. Congressman, I'm one of the many who will miss your voice in the House of Representatives. You are leaving for all the right reasons. Nevertheless, I really wish you were hanging around. Thank
Can
you
I
very
mention
much.
one other thing real
Yeah,
quick?
please,
So
please
I
do.
should have mentioned this in that last response. The other thing I'm struck by is, like, we all have agency in this, right? President Kennedy said in a democracy, we all hold office as citizens in our democracy. And so it's easy to look at how things are and just say, like, well, I guess that's how it needs to be. That's not how it needs to be. We all have agency. You know, the Rabbi Jonathan Sacks lays out the difference between optimism and hope. He said optimism is a passive virtue. It's the belief that things will get better. And hope is an active virtue. It's the belief that together we can make things better. He said it doesn't take courage to have optimism, but it does take courage to hope. I think that's really important because if we are going to have hope about our democracy and about our country, it means we need to understand that we all have a role to play in it, including your students. So.
I will make sure our students hear that. I hope other students hear that as well. As always, Congressman, it's a pleasure to talk to you, and I look forward to learning what you do next and anything we can do to help as you help us get better at democracy.
Thanks so much, Peter. Appreciate you.
Thanks, Congressman. Thanks, everybody, for joining. I'll email around a link to the recording and to all the stuff the Congressman mentioned, and we'll hopefully talk to everyone soon. Have a great week, everybody.
Bye. Thanks.